1 Samuel chapter 14. As I was preparing and studying for this evening, I noticed something a little bit unusual in my notes. I have an awful lot of exclamation points in my notes, which is kind of atypical. Usually I have mostly periods, and sometimes it's not even sentences, but lots of exclamation points because this is a fairly intense passage of Scripture that we're going to be looking at tonight. 1 Samuel chapter 14. To catch us up with what's going on, because we kind of we broke off, chapter 13 kind of breaks off right in the middle of the story, so we'll just kind of get the wheels turning and keep going. Saul's victory over the Ammonites in 1 Samuel 11 was the high watermark of his rule. That was as good as it gets. After that, we saw that he made his first and most consequential error as king last week. In chapter 12. He was in Gilgal, and in Gilgal he was supposed to wait. He was supposed to wait for Samuel to come and offer sacrifices, but he got impatient, and you remember the enemy, the Philistines, were surrounding him. The Philistines were sending out raiding parties. It was just a mess. There were enemies everywhere. His army that started out at 300 was hemorrhaging men. He was losing men all over the place. He was down to 600. So that's a pretty great reduction from 3,000 to 600. And so Saul decided to act independently. And in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 9, he committed the sin that cost him being able to pass the kingdom down to his son. His firstborn son's name was Jonathan. We know a little bit about him. Jonathan will play a role in the story of Saul and certainly in the story of David. But that was the event that lost him the kingdom. Now Samuel arrived just as Saul was finishing up his act of disobedience. And Samuel gave him the word of the Lord concerning his punishment. He said, "What you've done is not right, and because of what you've done, you've lost the kingdom. And God is going to take the kingdom from you, from your family. There will be no Saul dynasty. God is going to take the kingdom from you and your family, and he's going to give it to a man after his own heart." And we know, of course, that young man was David. And at this point, he would have been a young man out in the hills around Bethlehem watching his father's sheep. But we left Israel in a precarious position at the end of chapter 13. How many swords do they have? They got 600 men. How many swords? 2 swords. And who's wearing them? Saul and Jonathan. That's not a good armament situation. It's already a bad situation because they're woefully undermanned. They're woefully outnumbered. The Philistines, we don't have an accurate count of how many there were, just that they had so many horsemen, so many chariots, and then infantry as the sands of the sea. So lots and lots of enemies, 600 men in Saul's army, 2 swords between them. Everybody else, they have modified farm implements, right? They have sharpened hoes and axes and mattocks that they're going to go to war with. Well, the Philistines were sending out raiding parties again from their base in Michmash. Michmash is a little place about 4 miles north of where Saul is encamped. They're sending out raiding parties in 3 different directions, and so they're just kind of spiraling out across the country, causing all sorts of problems. And then the Philistines, we read in verse 23 of chapter 13, that they took a passage outside of Michmash, and there they waited for Israel to respond. They've opened the battle with their first salvo, as it were, and now they're waiting for Israel and her new king to man up and to come to respond to what they've done. And we see them do that tonight here with Jonathan's initiative in verse 1. We read, "And it came to pass upon a day that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said unto the young man that bare his armor, Come, and let us go over to the Philistine garrison that is on the other side. But he told not his father." Now that phrase, or some variation of it, that he didn't tell his father, is going to be repeated. And when God repeats something in his word, it's because we need to know it. Okay? This is a pivotal point for the story as it progresses. And we won't even cover all of it tonight. that this affects. But Saul doesn't know about Jonathan's plan. Jonathan is going to take the initiative. He says to his armor bearer, he says, let's go. Let's go take on the Philistines. Now, we'll find out in the next verse that the Jews were encamped in Gibeah, in Saul's hometown. So if you look here on the map, if you look in the inset, you see, just up from the bottom, you see Gibeah right there. That's Saul's hometown. And if you go straight north almost, and just a little bit to the east, you come to Michmash. So there are about 4 miles between them if you're going just straight across. Okay, now how straight were the roads? Probably not that straight, because this is what that territory looks like. This is the central highland region of Israel. So roads don't go real straight. Roads kind of hug the bottom of the hills. So it's 4 miles from Michmash down to Gibeah, where Saul is. So the Philistine stronghold and Saul's stronghold, about 4 miles between them. So you would have had their guards would have been running into each other. And we'll see that just a little bit later. But Jonathan apparently tires of this stalemate, and he decides to act independently of his father, and even independently of the rest of the army. He doesn't say, men, raise a battalion and follow me. He looks at one other man and he says, let's go do this again. But he told not his father. Now, it's interesting that chapter 13, you remember we looked at that. Chapter 13 started with Jonathan winning a fight against the Philistine garrison. And chapter 14 finds him doing the same thing. This is not the first time that Jonathan has gone to war with uneven odds. This is not the first time that Jonathan has seen God work a victory in uneven odds, which accounts for the great faith that he's going to show here in the coming verses. But first, let's look at Saul's court, because it's kind of explained to us in verse 2. Because speaking of Saul, Saul doesn't know what his son is doing. We read in verse 2, and Saul tarried in the uttermost part of Gibeah, under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron, and the people that were with him were about 600 men. So he has most of the army with him. He's sitting under a pomegranate tree in Migron. Culturally speaking, this wasn't unusual. Okay, if you remember back in the book of Judges, Deborah had her judgeship, and the place that she judged from was actually under a tree. It was kind of common, and in this case, Saul is not actively doing anything. He's waiting. What's he waiting for? We don't know. He's sitting there. His land. He's the king of a united Israel, and his land has invaders in the middle of it. And he is sitting under a pomegranate tree in Migron. Now, Migron means precipice. Some have thought that this may have been the location of a threshing floor. Now, threshing floors obviously would be at the top of a hill, because you're counting on the cross breeze to blow the chaff away as you winnow your wheat or your grain. So he's under a pomegranate tree on a hill with 600 men. So all of his army is sitting. They're not really doing anything. They're not out reconnoitering the area. They're not out conducting raids against the Philistines. They're not out setting up blockades. They're sitting under a pomegranate tree. He's sitting here with the 600 men who hadn't deserted or fled to the eastern side of the Jordan. You remember, that's what happened to the other men of his army. He started with 3,000, and they went, you saw that picture of the hills? They disappeared into the hills, and they were hiding in the cliffs and in the holes and just all over the place, and some of them went so far as to cross Jordan. They said, forget it. We're putting some real barriers between us and these Philistines. So they went over to the other side of Jordan. Saul is also joined by some other named individuals. Look in verse 3. And Ahiah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's prophet in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. And the people knew not that Jonathan was gone. Now let's deal with that somewhat run-on sentence of the family tree there. He is with Ahiah. Ahiah would be the Eli's great-grandson. Now, if you remember, back early on, when Hophni and Phinehas died, Phinehas' wife went into labor when she heard the news of the loss of the ark and the loss of her husband. You remember this? Well, apparently there was another child that had been born to her, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas. So this would have been Phinehas' nephew, Ahitub's son, and the great-grandson of Eli. Now, what do we know about, well, first off, we see that he's wearing an ephod, so he's there in official capacity. He's there as a priest. What do we know about the descendants of Eli as it relates to the priesthood? You remember? They're not, it's not going to work out. As a matter of fact, if you want to, I'll read it to you, but if you'd like, flip back to 1 Samuel 2, verse 31, and we'll read. This is what God said about the descendants of Eli. So, Ahitub is sitting, Ahiah is sitting with Saul under the pomegranate tree in Migron, and he's there with this man who we read about in 1 Samuel 2:31, where we read, Behold, the days come that I will cut off thine arm, and the arm of thy father's house. This is God speaking to Eli. That there shall not be an old man in thine house, and thou shalt see an enemy in my habitation, in all the wealth which God shall give Israel. And there shall not be an old man in thine house forever. And the man of thine, whom I shall not cut off from mine altar, shall be to consume thine eyes, and to grieve thine heart. And all the increase of thine house shall die in the flower of their age. That's a pretty rough pronouncement, right? That's what God says of the descendants of Eli. Because of Eli's sin, and because of the sin of his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they're going to face this. So as we go through 1 Samuel, we're looking, I mentioned this when we started this study, look for generational blessings and generational curses. We know that no male descendant of Eli will live to old age in the priesthood. So just put a marker here in your mind and in your Bible. This is in accordance with prophecy. Follow this name. Saul is here with Ahiah, the Lord's priest in Shiloh, which is where Eli had lived. That's where Samuel had gotten his start, in Shiloh. And it says that he was wearing an ephod. An ephod. Now, this is some artist representation of an ephod. It was the white garment that they wore. Okay? Not, you see the very ornate breastplate? That's called the breastplate, not the ephod. Okay? The ephod was the undergarment, not the all the way undergarment, but the garment that would have been worn white, usually very pristine, and it showed this guy is a priest. Not all priests wore breastplates, but all priests would have worn ephods. So he's wearing this ephod. Yes?
I see a lot of priests wearing those styles too, even today.
Yep. They still kind of the same flowing robes and they have lots of layers. Well, he's here and he's wearing this ephod. Now, it was typically worn, and we could probably surmise that since he is the acting priest from Shiloh, he very well may have been wearing the decorative breastplate. Okay? The breastplate contains stones, one stone for each of the 12 tribes, arranged in rows, as you see there. It also, the breastplate, would have had a little pouch where there were two stones. Do you remember what the two stones that were kept in the breastplate were? It's the Urim and the Thummim. Okay? You remember what they were used for? They were used for the casting of lots. They were God's special stones that he used to reveal his will to his people. The Urim and the Thummim. Now, that doesn't play in a whole lot at this point, but if you hold the thought, it will come back. So we need to, again, put a marker there. Saul is in Gibeah, sitting under a pomegranate tree at the top of a hill, with Ahiah, the great-grandson of Eli, wearing the priestly garments, but he's just sitting. He's not doing anything. And again, we see here in this verse that Jonathan's secrecy is mentioned again in verse 3. And the people knew not that Jonathan was gone. So in verse 1 we hear that he doesn't tell his dad. In verse 3 we find nobody knows. And we see the faith of two men come into play in verse 4. And between the passages by which Jonathan sought to go over unto the Philistine garrison, there was a sharp rock on the one side and a sharp rock on the other side. The name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other Sina. So Jonathan and his armor-bearer are on their way to pick a fight with the numberless enemies. Okay? They are in number as the sands of the sea, and they're going to pick a fight, and they come to this specific passage through the mountains. We don't know exactly where this is. We can't take you and show you pictures of the actual rocks, but these pinnacles, there's one on the north and one on the south. There's Bozez, which means gleaming or glistening. Some have translated this to mean slippery. And then there's another one, Sina, which translates thorny. So you have two peaks that are rising up, and they have enough distinction that people have actually given them names. Verse 5. And the forefront of the one was situate northward over against Michmash, and the other southward over against Gibeah. So one's on one side, the other's on the other, and they're passing through these stones, these pinnacles. On this passage, they're going up to make some trouble with God's enemies. Verse 6. And Jonathan said to the young man that bare his armor, Come, let us go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised. That would have been a common insult for the Jews to say. Let's go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us. For there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. So Jonathan looks at his armor-bearer, whose name we are not told, ever. And he says, let's go see what God can do. Okay, let's go see what God can do. It may be that the Lord will work for us. Jonathan didn't, well, real quick, let me give you how many Philistines, again, let me actually read the verse to you. In chapter 13, verse 5, it says, And the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. And we have Jonathan and his armor-bearer going up against that crowd. How many swords? There's two in their whole possession of the army. How many are going up for this fight? Just the one, because Saul's got the other one. It's sitting under a pomegranate tree in Gibeah. Okay, so Jonathan goes up. He's got his sword. He's going to go up against numberless foes. Now, Jonathan didn't fight with all of them. They're not all in battle array. He's going up and he's picking a fight with a large enough contingent, because it says that he's going against a garrison. A garrison would denote typically the presence of a barracks. So we're not talking dozens, we're talking hundreds at least. And perhaps because of where they're located, it could have been a contingent of the main army that Jonathan is going up against. Again, only two, and only one of those two has a sword. But Jonathan isn't depending on his numbers at all. He says as much. He's not depending on his swordsmanship. Or, as we'll see in a moment, he's not depending on the element of surprise. If I were going to go up and attack a garrison with just me and one other guy, I'd go in the dead of night, and I would sneak into tents, and I would try to stab people while they're sleeping, and try to get as far as I could before I got caught. That's not what's going to happen here. Jonathan and his armor-bearer are preparing to make a frontal assault on an elevated position. Okay? In military terms, they would call that suicide. Okay? Two guys against numberless forces. You're going against them, and you're going to throw the element of surprise out the window, and you're going to do this? His reasoning is given to us here in verse 6. There's no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. Maybe Jonathan was thinking back. He would have been told stories about Shamgar. Shamgar, we read about him in Judges 3:31. He's the one who went up and killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad, a pointy stick. and he killed 600. Or maybe he had heard stories about Samson. Samson killed 1,000 Philistines in one sitting with an odd tool. Do you remember what it was? The jawbone of a donkey, and he killed 1,000 men with it. So Jonathan goes up, and he's not going into untested waters here. He's taking gigantic leaps of faith based on the fact God has done this before. Again, God had used Jonathan to do things similar in chapter 13. Jonathan had gone up against a garrison. And so this is essentially Jonathan and his armor bearer saying, we're going to go up here and let God do it again. We're going to go up here and we're going to let God do something. It doesn't matter how many of us there are. God doesn't even need us. But let's make ourselves available to it. Let's go up and see what God will do. Let's see if he'll do it again. Verse 7. And his armor bearer said unto him, forget it, man, you're on your own. No, is that what he said? No, he said, do all that is in thine heart. Turn thee. Behold, I'm with thee according to thy heart. Great faith in an unnamed Bible character who's going to go up here against a largely outnumbering force. Interesting. Courage begets courage, doesn't it? That's what's going on here. Jonathan looks at his armor bearer. He says, hey, God can do this. God's not bound by how many men we are. Let's go up and let's do a work. Let's go up and see God use us against these uncircumcised Philistines. And the young man, his armor bearer, says, let's do it. By the same token, courage begets courage. Where's Saul again? Sitting under a tree in Gibeah. And where are the 600 men of Saul's army? Sitting under a tree with Saul in Gibeah. Only this one man of faith, Jonathan, goes out. He goes out, he says, let's go see. God's done this before. He's done it with Shamgar. He's done it with Samson. He even let me in on it one time. Let's go do it again. And his armor bearer says, let's do it. And so Jonathan gives his strategy in verse 8. And Jonathan said, behold, we will pass over unto these men, and we will discover ourselves unto them. Meaning, we're not going to try to surprise them. We're going to make some racket so that they know we're coming. We're going to go discover ourselves unto them. And if they say unto us, tarry until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up unto them. But if they say thus, come up unto us, then we will go up, for the Lord hath delivered them into our hand, and this shall be a sign unto us. Again, no surprise. There's no, we got to be quiet. They're going to go and they're going to make enough noise that they get recognized. Jonathan and his armor bearer are counting on God alone. And they know that if he doesn't fight for them, they don't have a prayer. This has got to be all God or we're sunk. But we know that God can, we know that God has, and we're asking God to do it again. They're going to go down into the valley, allow themselves to be discovered, and the signal they're looking for, kind of like Gideon had a fleece to prove that God was going to do something, kind of their fleece is, we're going to make some noise, and if the Philistines tell us to come up to their position, then we'll know. God's going to do something, that this is our cue that God's going to do it again. And so they take action in verse 11, and both of them discovered themselves unto the garrison of the Philistines. How do you figure that went? I can only imagine. You think about the adrenaline rush that these guys were having right now. Both of them discovered themselves unto the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, behold, the Hebrews come forth out of the holes where they've hid themselves. They're not lying, are they? You remember what we read in chapter 13, verse 6? When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, then the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. So the Philistines are just pointing out what is actually happening. Oh, they're coming out of the woodwork. They're crawling out from under the rocks. The Philistines didn't think much of their adversaries. Israel had been harassed by the Philistines for as long as they'd been in the land. Do you imagine that the Philistines felt threatened by these two? They've got an elevated position. They've got massive numbers on their side. And they look down there and they can only see one sword. Odds are pretty good for the Philistines, aren't they? They think, well, come on up. We'll have some fun with you before we knock you off. Verse 12. And the men of the garrison answered Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, come up to us. We'll show you a thing. What do you figure the thing was? Probably whatever sword they happened to be carrying. We'll show you a thing. Jonathan said unto his armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord hath delivered them into the hand of Israel. Again, they would have had quite the adrenaline rush when they were making noise to get discovered, and then when they realized this is happening, God's doing it right now, they go up. Jonathan looks at his armor bearer and says, it's happening. Let's go. God's going to do something epic here in just a minute. Verse 13, and Jonathan climbed up upon his hands and upon his feet. That means it was pretty steep that he had to do that. Climbed up upon his hands and his feet, and his armor bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer slew after him. So, essentially, Jonathan goes whirling in, and he's knocking him down and putting him over, and his armor bearer is following behind him, and he's putting him down. How long do you figure it took the armor bearer to get a sword? Not long, right? First guy who Jonathan knocks off, he says, now I got a sword too. And they can both go at it. Why? Because God's doing something great. Again, it's not dependent on the two men. It's not dependent on their swordsmanship. It's dependent on God and God alone. That's what's going on here. Verse 14. And that first slaughter, which denotes there was more to follow, and that first slaughter, which Jonathan and his armor bearer made, was about 20 men, within, as it were, an half acre, which is a yoke of oxen might plow. So they go through 10-to-1 odds. They take them all out. Verse 15. And there was a trembling in the host. Which host? The Philistine host, right? Because the Israelite host, if you want to call the 600 men a host, they're still sitting under a tree in Gibeah. So there's a trembling in the host, in the field, and among all the people. The garrison and the spoilers, they also trembled. And the earth quaked. So it was a very great trembling. Everything's shaking. Okay? All the men, all of the cavalry, even the ground itself is shaking. Now, how do you figure Jonathan worked that out? Jonathan didn't work that out. Again, it's all God. Remember, it's not dependent on the two men. It's not dependent on their swordsmanship. God is doing a work. God sends a trembling into their heart. God makes the earth itself begin to shake. There's panic. There's disorder among the ranks of the Philistines in Michmash. Verse 16. And the watchmen of Saul in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude melted away. And they went on beating down one another. Now, again, it's 4 miles from Gibeah to Michmash. It's 4 miles northeast. But assuming that Saul had some military experience, which we know he did, at least a little bit, he would have probably had a picket line of some sort. So he would have had guards that would have been out where they could keep an eye on Michmash so that they can say, hey, they're arming up and they're marching our way. They would have an advance notice. And so Saul's outside picket line gets a view of what's going on. They say, everybody's shaking. The ground is shaking. And they're killing one another. Because that's what starts to happen. The Philistines start to kill one another. They went on beating down one another. Suddenly, these guards of Saul's have something exciting to report. The multitude melted away. That means that they dissolved. The Philistines lost all of their military order and they started to run. If you were a Philistine and you were in Michmash, you would run likely in the direction of home, which would be to the west, towards the Mediterranean, towards the Philistine cities. It says they went on beating down one another. In their panic, How many were against? How many men are they fighting? Just the two. And they get all worked up and they start beating each other down. Does this remind you of anything that happened maybe in the book of Judges? When Gideon and his 300 went against the massively outnumbering Midianite army, and they blew their trumpets and shattered their pitchers and held up their torches and said, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." And then they didn't really even have to do any fighting because the Midianites started falling all over one another and killing each other. And that's what's happening here. Because two men decided to see what God could do. And that they went up and God caused something to happen. Judges chapter 7 verse 22 tells us of that incident with Gideon. It says, "And the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host." Jonathan didn't have to kill the horsemen and the charioteers and the men without number. They were doing it themselves. Just like Jonathan had counted on, God was doing a miracle. Now, we're going to stop here because we're out of time, but hold what you've got for just one moment. Because who knows that Jonathan is doing this? Nobody knows. Do the advance guard, does the picket line know that is reporting back, "Hey, the Philistines are falling apart. They're killing each other in Michmash"? They don't know. Nobody knows what's going on. Just all of a sudden they have all of this activity. But Saul is going to find out what's going on, and he's going to get involved. Now Saul is not a man who's being led of the Lord right now, and we'll see that if you read ahead in chapter 14, and I would encourage you to do so. God has already started not answering Saul, okay, because of his sin. So read ahead and you'll get that. But because Saul doesn't know what to do, he's going to make some very foolish decisions. And he's going to come very, very close to turning this tremendous, divinely given victory into a tragedy. He'll be just that close to it, a hairbreadth from turning this tremendous victory into a tragedy. But there are a couple lessons for us from this passage. When you're looking at what you consider to be a hopeless situation, and there are lots. There could be, you look at our country, you look at your family perhaps, you look at a situation with friends or acquaintances. Take heart, because like verse 6 says, there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. God is still in the business of working things out. This stunt by Jonathan makes zero sense militarily. To go against a vastly outnumbered force in an elevated position with a frontal assault without the element of surprise doesn't make any sense. But Jonathan's not counting on any of that. He says, God can do it. And God can work out the situations in your life that you would think, it's hopeless. There's nothing. Nobody can fix this. Well, God can. And God's not bound. God's not limited. There's no restraint to the Lord to save. God can use Jonathan and his armor bearer. God could use Gideon's 300. Jesus used 12 apostles. He used a little boy's lunch. He used Balaam's donkey. And he can do a work with us if we'll make ourselves available. Why did God use Jonathan and not Saul? Because Saul was sitting under a tree in Gibeon. And Jonathan, a man of faith, who did have fellowship with Jehovah, said, "Hey, let's go see what God can do. This looks hopeless." It wouldn't have made any difference. If all 600 had gone along in this, it still would have taken God. And Jonathan realized, look, God's not bound. He could do it with you and me. He could do it without you and me. He could do it with all of us. But God's not bound to use what we think he should. Again, the reason God didn't use Saul is because he was sitting under a tree. The victory wasn't because of Jonathan. And if Jonathan could speak to us tonight, he'd tell us as much. This victory was all about God. I would imagine that Jonathan, when he talked to his children, and we know he had some, when Jonathan told his children, he wasn't the hero of this story. God was. It wasn't, hey, kids, let me tell you about the time I went up against an innumerable host of Philistines. I charged uphill, and man, me and my armor bearer, I was knocking them down, and he was killing them. It was all about, let me tell you what God did. Back when your grandfather was king. Let me tell you about this. Let me tell you what God did. The only explanation for Jonathan's victory was God. And so that leads me to ask one question in closing here tonight. What is it about my life that's only explainable because of the God I claim to serve? What is it about your life that's only explainable because of the God you claim to serve? We make some pretty bold claims about our God, don't we? We talk big about our God. We say, oh, we serve the God who split the Red Sea. We serve the God who turned a man who hated the church. He was set out to destroy it, and God turned him into its greatest evangelist. We talk about a big God, but how many things in my life and in yours can only be explained by the fact that I serve a really big God? Because if I believe that God is still powerful, that God is still able, and that God's hand is not restrained, then I'm going to attempt big things for God. Is there a person who I say, God couldn't save them? Is there a situation, God can't fix this? Because God's hand is still not short. God's hand is still strong. And Jonathan proves it. A young man, he comes from a kind of an iffy family at this point. His father is in a weird place, and he's going to go through some terrible times, but he was used of God. This isn't the first, and it won't be the last time that Jonathan will be used of God to do great things. So read ahead, because this battle isn't over. The Philistines are in full panic. They're killing each other, and they're running towards home, but there's more to the battle that we'll look at next week in the verses to follow. So read ahead. Any questions before we close in a word of prayer tonight? Then let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for being the same God who Jonathan served, who David served. Lord, the same God from all these, for all these years and for all these tremendous acts. Lord, I pray that we would be faithful to attempt great things for you. Lord, I pray that there would be many things in each of our lives that would only be explainable because of the God we serve. Lord, as Jonathan admitted to his armor bearer that you're not restrained to save by many or by few. I pray that you would use each and every one of us. Lord, I pray that you would use us here as a church, as families, as individuals. I pray that you'd use us to make a difference in our community. And Lord, even in our state, in our nation, I pray that you'd use us. And we'll praise you because you would be the one who did it. We pray these things in Christ's name.